The overhead lights of the banquet hall didn't just illuminate the room, they felt like a spotlight on every sacrifice I'd made over the last 20 years. The air smelled of expensive floor wax and the stiff starch of dress blues. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a rhythmic drumbeat of pride. Then the chair scraped. My father, a man whose approval I had chased like a ghost through a fog, stood up. The room went graveyard quiet. He didn't look at the general. He didn't look at the flag. He looked straight at the cameras recording for the local news and said, "I can't keep pretending she's my daughter anymore." The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a physical weight. I saw my commanding officer's hand freeze mid-air. I saw my fellow officers exchange glances that felt like needles. But I didn't break. I didn't cry. I simply turned toward him, adjusted the silver eagle on my shoulder, and let a small, cold smile touch my lips. "Fine, Howard," I said, my voice steady enough to cut glass. "If tonight you wanted the truth, let's give it to them." I stepped toward the honor table, my boots clicking with military precision on the hardwood. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small dented tin box, the kind that used to hold peppermint lozenges in the 1960s. When I set it on the white linen tablecloth, Howard's face went from a triumphant mask of cruelty to the color of wet ash. His hand reached out, twitching as if to snatch it, but I was faster. To understand how we got to this podium, to this moment of public execution, you have to understand the house I grew up in. It was a neat split-level home in a suburb of Ohio, the kind with a manicured lawn and a flag flying on the porch every 4th of July. To the neighbors, Howard Miller was a pillar of the community, a successful insurance adjuster, and a deacon at the church. But inside those four walls, the air was always thin. My mother, Elena, was a soft-spoken woman who seemed to spend her entire life trying to occupy as little space as possible. She moved like a shadow, always smoothing out the wrinkles Howard left behind. As a child, I remember the way he looked at me. It wasn't hatred. Hatred is an active emotion. It was more like he was looking at a clerical error, a mistake in his ledger that he couldn't quite erase. "You have your mother's weakness, Sarah," he'd say when I tripped in the yard or brought home a B+ instead of an A. He never hugged me when I graduated high school. He didn't walk me down the aisle during my brief, ill-fated marriage in my early 20s. He was a man of stone carved by some secret bitterness I couldn't name. The only thing I ever truly owned of my mother's was that tin box. She gave it to me 3 days before the cancer took her back when I was just 22 and lost in the world. Her hands were shaking, paper-thin skin stretched over bone. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp, "Howard is a man who values his shadow more than his soul. He has spent 30 years building a monument to himself. If that monument ever threatens to crush you, if he ever tries to take your honor to save his own, you open this." At the time I thought she was delirious. I tucked the box away in my cedar chest and joined the army. I needed the structure. I needed to belong to something where the rules were clear, and merit was earned, not granted by the whims of a cold father. The army became my real family. I climbed the ranks from second lieutenant to major and now finally to colonel. I served 2 tours in the desert, spent nights in the mud, and learned that leadership isn't about the voice you use but the backbone you show. Through all those years, Howard stayed in Ohio, a distant, icy sun. He'd call occasionally, usually to complain about his taxes, or to tell me that my choice of career was unbecoming of a lady. When the invitation for my promotion ceremony went out, I didn't expect him to come. In fact, I'd hoped he wouldn't. But a week ago he called. His voice was different, anxious, almost oily. He told me he was proud. He told me he wanted to be there to see his little girl get her eagles. I should have known then. A man like Howard doesn't change his spots at 70. He just finds a new way to camouflage them. The ceremony was supposed to be the crowning achievement of my career. The local VFW was there, the mayor was in the front row, and my mentor General Harrison was presiding. It was a room full of people who believed in the American dream, the idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, you get your day in the sun. But as I stood on that stage looking out at the sea of uniforms and friendly faces, I felt a chill. Howard wasn't looking at me with pride. He was looking at the reporters. He was looking at the prestige of the event. He had spent the last few months embroiled in a nasty legal battle back home, something about a fraudulent land deal that threatened to strip him of his deacon status and his comfortable retirement. He needed a distraction. He needed to be the victim. And then he stood up. He didn't just deny me. He tried to unmake me. By claiming I wasn't his daughter, he wasn't just airing family laundry. He was implying my entire life, the very foundation of my identity, which I had presented to the military for 20 years, was built on a lie. In the military, your character is your currency. If you lied about your kin, what else did you lie about? I felt the eyes of the general on me. I felt the disappointment of the old veterans in the back. Howard thought he had me trapped. He thought I would break down in tears, flee the stage, and let him spin a tale of how he had been deceived by an ungrateful woman he took in as his own. He wanted to be the tragic hero of a lie. But he forgot one thing. He didn't raise me, the army did, and my mother gave me the ammunition. I stared at him across the small distance of the podium. His face was a mask of feigned heartbreak. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he stammered loud enough for the microphones to catch. "I just can't live the lie anymore. Your mother, she wasn't honest. You aren't mine." A gasp rippled through the hall. My heart slowed down. Everything became very clear. I reached into my bag. I pulled out the tin box. "You're right about one thing, Howard," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You aren't my father, but it's not for the reason you think." I flipped the latch on the box. The metal groaned. Inside there was a stack of yellowed letters and a single heavy object, wrapped in a tattered piece of olive drab wool. I felt the weight of 30 years of secrets resting in my palm. Howard's eyes went wide. He knew exactly what was in that box. He knew that the monument he'd built to himself was about to come crashing down, and I was the one holding the sledgehammer. The heavy silence in the hall was broken only by the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning. I could see the sweat beads forming on Howard's upper lip. He took a half step back, his hand gripping the edge of the linen-covered table so hard his knuckles turned the color of bone. He knew. He had spent 3 decades betting that my mother was too broken to speak, and that I was too loyal to doubt him. He had bet wrong. I reached into the tin box and pulled out the first item, a folded, brittle piece of notebook paper. It wasn't a DNA test. In the world Howard lived, in a world of reputations and handshakes, a piece of science wasn't nearly as damning as a piece of history. General Harrison, ladies and gentlemen. I began, my voice projecting to the back of the room as if I were giving a briefing at the Pentagon. My father, or rather Mr. Miller, has spent this evening attempting to reveal a truth about my bloodline to shield himself from his own crumbling reputation back in Ohio. He wants you to believe I am a product of my mother's deceit. He wants to play the martyr. I unfolded the paper. This is a letter dated August 14, 1974. It's written by a man named Thomas Miller, Howard's older brother. A man this community remembers as a war hero who died in a helicopter crash over the jungles of Vietnam. A murmur rippled through the older veterans in the back of the room. Thomas Miller was a local legend, a name etched into the granite memorial in the town square. Howard had rode the coattails of his brother's ghost for 40 years, using Thomas's hero status to build his own insurance empire and his seat in the church. Thomas wasn't just Howard's brother. I continued, my eyes never leaving Howard's shrinking form. He was my mother's first husband, and he was my father. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Howard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping on a dry deck. The story Howard told everyone, the story he used to get elected to the board and to gain the trust of every veteran in the county, was that he stepped in to save a grieving widow and her unborn child out of the goodness of his heart. But this letter, written by Thomas just days before he died, tells a different story. It tells of a brother back home who had been systematically draining Thomas's paychecks, forged his signature on a life insurance policy, and was pressuring Elena to leave him. I pulled the second item from the box, a heavy, tarnished set of silver dog tags. They clinked against the tin, a metallic sound of judgment. When Thomas died, Howard didn't save us. He silenced us. He told my mother that if she ever revealed the truth about his theft and his cowardice, he would use his influence to ensure she was declared unfit and that I was taken away. He forced her into a marriage of convenience to bury his crimes under the guise of family honor. I looked at the general. He isn't standing here tonight because he can't pretend I'm his daughter. He's standing here because he found out I've been looking into the records of the 101st Airborne. He's standing here because he knows that as a colonel, I have the resources to finally clear my father's name and expose the man who stole a dead hero's legacy. The revenge wasn't a shout. It was the slow, methodical peeling back of a mask. For the men and women in that room, people over 60 who had lived through the era of that war, who understood what it meant to betray a brother in arms, this wasn't just a family squabble. It was a desecration. Howard finally found his voice, though it was thin and reedy. Those are the ramblings of a dying man. You're trying to destroy me to cover up your mother's shame. I didn't flinch. I reached back into the box and pulled out the final piece of evidence, a carbon copy of a bank ledger from 1975, showing the transfer of Thomas Miller's military death gratuity into a private account held solely by Howard. "Honor isn't something you inherit, Howard," I said softly, stepping closer to him. "And it isn't something you can steal. You spent 30 years pretending to be the man your brother actually was. You used my mother's fear to build a pedestal for yourself, but tonight that pedestal is gone." The general stood up. He didn't look at me. He looked at Howard. In the military, there is a specific kind of look a superior gives to someone who has committed the ultimate act of unbecoming conduct. It is a look of total erasure. "Military police." The general said, his voice quiet but echoing. "Please escort Mr. Miller to the foyer. We have a ceremony to finish." 2 young MPs stepped forward. They didn't use force, but they moved with the weight of the entire U.S. Army behind them. Howard looked around the room, searching for a friendly face, a fellow deacon, a golf partner, a neighbor. But every head turned away. The silence he had used to trap my mother for decades had finally turned on him. He was a ghost in a room full of living history. As they led him out, he stumbled. He looked old, not the distinguished old he had cultivated, but a fragile, hollow kind of old. The door swung shut behind him, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I could take a full breath of air. I turned back to the audience. My heart was still racing, but the coldness was gone. I looked at the dog tags in my hand, the silver reflecting the bright stage lights. I wasn't Sarah Miller, daughter of the insurance man. I was Sarah, daughter of Thomas. "I apologize for the interruption, General," I said, standing at a perfect attention. "I am ready to proceed." The general walked toward me. He didn't pick up the eagles right away. He looked at the tin box on the table, then back at me. "Colonel," he said, and the use of the new rank before the pin was even on felt like a benediction. "Your father would have been damn proud of your aim tonight." The applause didn't start as a roar. It started with a single set of hands, an old vet in the 3rd row wearing a faded Vietnam veteran cap, then another. Within seconds, the hall was thundering. It wasn't just for my promotion. It was for a truth 30 years in the making. But as the cheers filled the room, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Revenge is a sharp blade, but it doesn't heal the wound it opens. I had my rank. I had my truth. But I still had to figure out what to do with the broken man waiting in the foyer. The applause was a physical wave, but as it receded, a hollow space opened up in my chest. I had spent years imagining this moment, the public unmasking the righteous fire of the truth. But as the ceremony wound down and the formal reception began, I found myself standing by the punch bowl, my new silver eagles feeling heavier than lead. People came up to me shaking my hand, their eyes filled with a mix of shock and newfound respect. They spoke of justice and courage, but all I could think about was the look on Howard's face as the MPs led him away. It wasn't the look of a villain, it was the look of a man who had suddenly realized his entire life was a house of cards, and the wind had finally picked up. General Harrison found me near the back exit. He didn't offer a platitude, he just nodded toward the heavy oak doors leading to the foyer. "He's still out there, Sarah," sitting on a bench like a man waiting for a bus that's never coming. The MPs are keeping an eye on him, but he's not going anywhere. He has nowhere to go, General. I said, my voice sounding distant even to myself. The news of what I said is already hitting the local wires. By tomorrow morning, every deacon at his church and every client at his firm will have heard the story. In his world, that's a death sentence. What do you want to do? The general asked. I looked down at the tin box still clutched in my left hand. I want to finish it. I walked out of the bright celebratory atmosphere of the hall and into the dimly lit foyer. Howard was slumped on a velvet-covered bench. His tie was loosened, and his expensive wool suit jacket looked 2 sizes too big for him. He looked like the very thing he had spent 40 years pretending not to be, a frail, frightened old man. When he heard my boots on the marble floor, he didn't look up. You had to do it here, he rasped. His voice wasn't angry anymore, it was just tired. At your own party, you destroyed your own night just to bury me. I didn't destroy the night, Howard. I reclaimed it. I sat down on the bench, leaving a deliberate 3 feet of space between us. You chose the battlefield when you stood up and tried to claim I wasn't your daughter. You thought my shame would be your shield. You forgot that I've spent my life learning how to dismantle shields. He finally looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot, the blue irises clouded with age and defeat. I did take care of you, Sarah. I gave you a home. I gave Elena a name that wasn't tarnished by her husband's failures. Failures. I felt the heat rise in my throat. Thomas didn't fail. He died serving his country. You're the one who failed. You stole from a dead brother's widow. You used a soldier's death to fund your first office. You built a life out of stolen bricks, Howard. Did you really think the mortar would hold forever? He looked away, his jaw working silently. For a moment, the old Howard flickered back, the man who always had an excuse, a rationalization for every cruelty. It was a different time. The business was struggling. I thought I could make it up to her, to you. I gave you everything money could buy. You gave me everything except the one thing a child needs, the truth of who they are. I opened the tin box and took out the dog tags. I held them out to him. Do you even remember what color his eyes were? Or have you spent so long staring at your own reflection that you've wiped him out of your memory entirely? Howard reached out his fingers, trembling. He didn't take the tags, but he touched the cold metal with the tip of his index finger. A single tear tracked through the deep wrinkles on his cheek. In that moment, the enemy disappeared. There was no more monster to slay, no more revenge to exact. There was only a broken, dishonest man facing the wreckage of his soul. She loved him, Howard whispered. It was the first honest thing I'd ever heard him say about my mother. Even after I married her, even after 10 years, she'd look at you and I'd see him in your eyes. Every time you smiled, every time you stood up straight. It was like he was back in the house judging me. I couldn't stand it. I had to make you feel small so I could feel big. The confession didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a tragedy. My mother had lived in a silent prison of his making, and he had lived in a prison of his own guilt. We had all been ghosts in that split-level house in Ohio. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely audible. Now we deal with the consequences, I said, standing up. The military lawyers will be looking into the insurance fraud regarding my father's death benefits. It's been decades, but there's no statute of limitations on honor. You'll likely lose the house. You'll definitely lose your standing in the community. He nodded slowly as if accepting a terminal diagnosis. And will you testify? I won't have to. The documents in this box speak for themselves. I looked at the exit doors. But I'm not going to let you die in a gutter, Howard. Not because I love you, but because my father, my real father, wouldn't have left a man behind, even a man like you. I signaled to one of my officers who was waiting by the door. Captain, please arrange for a car to take Mr. Miller to a hotel, not his home. He shouldn't be alone tonight. As I turned to walk back into the hall, Howard called out my name. I stopped, but I didn't turn around. Sarah, he paused, his voice cracking. I really was proud of you today. Before I stood up, I saw you up there, and for a second I thought, maybe I did something right. You didn't do this, Howard, I said firmly. I did, my mother did, and the man whose name you tried to erase did. You were just a witness. I walked back into the ceremony, leaving the darkness of the foyer behind. The room was still full of people, but I didn't go back to the punch bowl. I went to the window and looked out at the American flag snapping in the night breeze under the floodlights. The revenge was over. The truth was out. But as I touched the new eagles on my shoulders, I realized that the real work, the work of healing and finding out who Sarah truly was without the shadow of Howard Miller, was only just beginning. The morning after the ceremony felt like the first day of a new life, but it lacked the sunshine I had expected. I woke up in my quarters at the base, the silver eagles of a colonel resting on the bedside table next to the old tin box. In the harsh, honest light of dawn, the adrenaline of the confrontation had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, gritty residue. I had dismantled Howard Miller in front of the world. I had won. So why did I feel like I was mourning? I spent the morning fielding calls. The general's office, the JAG lawyers, and even a few old family friends from Ohio who had seen the snippets on the news. The story was spreading with the efficiency of a wildfire. The hero's brother was a fraud. The colonel's father was a thief. To the public, it was a juicy scandal, a Shakespearean tumble from grace. But to me, it was the surgical removal of a tumor that had been wrapped around my spine for 40 years. Around noon, I drove to the modest hotel where I'd sent Howard. I didn't go there to gloat. In the military, we have a term called after-action review. You look at the wreckage, you count the cost, and you figure out how to move forward. I found him in the hotel's small breakfast nook, staring into a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. He looked smaller today, his skin sagging like parchment. "The lawyers called me," he said, not looking up as I sat down across from him. "They're freezing the accounts. The church board held an emergency meeting this morning. I'm out, Sarah. All of it. Gone." "You knew this was coming, Howard," I said, my voice calm. "The moment you decided to use this ceremony as a platform for your lie, you threw the first punch. I just finished the fight." "I thought I could control it," he whispered, finally meeting my eyes. "I've controlled the narrative for so long. I thought if I made you the liar, the imposter, no one would listen to anything you found in your mother's things. I was a fool to think I could outmaneuver a colonel." I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see the giant who had overshadowed my childhood. I saw a man who was a slave to his own ego. "You didn't lose because of my rank, Howard. You lost because the truth has a way of breathing even when you bury it under 30 years of dirt. My mother knew that. That's why she kept the box. She didn't want revenge. She wanted me to have a choice." "And what is your choice now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "To watch me go to prison. To watch me lose the house she lived in. I'm not a judge, Howard. The law will decide what happens with the money you took from my father's estate. But I'm not here to strip you of your dignity. You did that yourself." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. "I made a call to a friend in the VA. Because you served however briefly and dishonorably you behaved afterward, you have a bed in a veterans' retirement home in Dayton. It's clean, it's quiet, and no one there knows who you are. It's a place to start over, or at least a place to finish out your days without a spotlight on your shame." He recoiled as if I'd slapped him. "A home you want to put me in a facility." "It's more than you gave my mother," I reminded him sharply. "You kept her in a facility of silence for 3 decades. At least in Dayton you'll have a window and 3 meals a day. It's mercy, Howard. Take it or don't. But the house in Ohio is being sold to repay the insurance debt. You can't go back." He slumped back into the vinyl chair, the fight finally leaving him. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was just empty. I realized then that my revenge wasn't about making him suffer. It was about making him irrelevant. He no longer had the power to hurt me, to define me, or to keep me from the memory of my true father. As I walked out of the hotel, I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was a loosening, a softening of a knot I had carried since I was 6 years old. I drove to a local park, a quiet place with an old stone bridge, and the sound of a rushing creek. I sat on a bench and opened the tin box one last time. I pulled out the photograph of Thomas Miller. He was leaning against a jeep, his sleeves rolled up, a crooked grin on his face. He looked so much like me, the same set of the jaw, the same stubborn light in the eyes. I traced the edges of the photo, feeling the connection that Howard had tried so hard to sever. "I found you, Dad," I whispered. For the older generation, for the men and women who grew up in the shadow of that war, names mean everything. Your name is your bond. It's what's etched on your headstone. Howard had tried to steal a name to build a life. I had used my name to build a career. But standing there by the water, I realized that I didn't need Howard's name, and I didn't even need Thomas's name to be whole. I was the sum of my mother's quiet strength and my father's lost potential. I was the architect of my own honor. The revenge was complete, but the story wasn't. The aftermath of a truth-telling is often messier than the lie itself. There were depositions to give a house to clear out, and a mother's reputation to fully restore in the eyes of a small Ohio town. But for the first time, I wasn't doing it out of anger. I was doing it out of duty. I looked at my watch. I had a briefing at 1400 hours. The world didn't stop because a family secret exploded. My soldiers were waiting. My country was waiting. I closed the tin box, tucked it under my arm, and headed toward my car. The path ahead was clear, and for the first time the wind was at my back. The process of dismantling a 30-year-old lie is not a single explosion. It is a long, tedious demolition. Over the next month, I became a regular visitor to the world Howard had built. I traveled back to that split-level house in Ohio, not as the ungrateful daughter, but as a colonel with a legal team and a box of ghosts. The town greeted me with a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound shame. People who had sat in pews next to Howard for decades now crossed the street to avoid my gaze, or worse, cornered me in the grocery store to offer hollow apologies for not seeing the signs. I spent my days in the attic of my childhood home sorting through the artifacts of a life built on sand. Howard had moved into the VA facility in Dayton, a move he made in a daze of defeat, leaving me to sift through the wreckage. It was there, among the mothballs and old tax returns, that I found the final pieces of my mother's story. She hadn't just been a victim. She had been a silent archivist. Taped to the bottom of an old sewing machine cabinet, I found a diary she'd kept during the first 5 years of her marriage to Howard. Reading her words felt like hearing her voice from across the sticks. She wrote about the grayness of Howard, the way he would recount the insurance money like a prayer. But she also wrote about me. "Sarah has Thomas's laugh today," one entry read. Howard turned his head away, but I saw the fear in him. He knows he can't buy her spirit. Every page I turned was another brick in the wall of my own identity. I wasn't a clerical error or a mistake. I was the living evidence of a love Howard couldn't touch. My revenge, I realized, wasn't about the promotion ceremony or the public shaming. It was about this, the quiet restoration of my mother's dignity in the privacy of an empty house. However, the legal repercussions were moving forward with military efficiency. The JAG office and the local prosecutor were building a case for grand theft by deception and insurance fraud. Because Howard had redirected military death benefits funds that were federally protected, the stakes were higher than just a local scandal. They were talking about a federal indictment. I went to see him in Dayton on a Tuesday. The facility was clean-smelling of industrial lemon cleaner and old wool. Howard was sitting in a communal sunroom, a deck of cards spread out in a game of solitaire that he wasn't winning. When he saw me, he didn't reach for his mask. The mask was broken beyond repair. "They're coming for the money, aren't they?" he asked, his voice a dry whisper. "They're coming for the truth, Howard. The money is just the paper trail." I sat down. I had brought the diary with me. "I found Mom's journals. I know about the threats you made in 1976. I know you told her you'd have her committed to the state hospital if she tried to claim the survivor benefits under Thomas's name." He closed his eyes, his head trembling slightly. "I was a young man who wanted to be someone. I thought if I had the capital, I could be the man everyone expected the Miller brothers to be. Thomas was always the star, Sarah. Even in death, he cast a shadow I couldn't get out of. I just wanted to be the one who survived and succeeded. Success at the cost of a dead brother's honor isn't success, Howard. It's a haunting. I pushed the diary toward him. You didn't just steal money. You stole my mother's right to grieve her husband. You made her live a lie for 30 years. You made her look her daughter in the eye and stay silent to keep me safe. That is a debt you can never repay. He looked at the diary, but he didn't touch it. What do they want from me now? They want a full confession. If you sign the depositions and relinquish the remaining assets, the house, the investments, they'll agree to a plea that keeps you in this facility rather than a federal prison. Your age and your health are the only things saving you from a cell, Howard. That and the fact that I told them I didn't want to see you in a jumpsuit. He looked up, a flicker of the old calculating Howard returning to his eyes. Why save me from that? Because my mother loved the man she thought you could be, and my father died so men like you could live in a free country. I stood up, adjusting my uniform jacket. And because I refuse to let your final chapter be my burden. If you go to prison, I'm the daughter of a convict. If you stay here and fade away, I'm just a woman who finally found her father. I'm doing this for me, not for you. As I walked out of the sunroom, I passed a group of veterans sitting around a television. They were talking about the old days, about the bases they'd served on, and the friends they'd lost. One of them, a man in a wheelchair with a Korean War veteran cap, nodded to me as I passed. "Good afternoon, Colonel," he said, his voice cracking with age, but sharp with respect. "Good afternoon, Sergeant," I replied, returning the salute with a crispness that felt like a prayer. In that exchange, I realized that Howard's plan had failed in the most fundamental way. He had tried to use my career to hide his crimes, but it was my career, my understanding of service discipline, and the weight of an oath that had given me the tools to destroy him. He had forged the sword that eventually cut him down. I drove back to the base that night, the Ohio landscape blurred by the rain. The revenge was shifting into something else. It was no longer a fire, it was a cooling forge. I thought about the thousands of men and women who serve, who leave behind families and secrets, and who trust that the people back home will guard their legacy. I had guarded Thomas's legacy even when I didn't know his name. The next step wasn't about Howard at all. It was about the town square back home. It was about a name on a granite wall that deserved to be cleared of its brother's shadow. I had one more mission to complete before I could truly wear those eagles with a light heart. I had to go back to the beginning. The following Sunday, I returned to our hometown for a different kind of ceremony. There were no cameras from the city news this time, and no banquet tables draped in white linen. There was just the cool, biting wind of an Ohio autumn and the smell of damp earth. I stood in the town square facing the Veterans Memorial, a slab of gray granite that had stood since the late 70s. I had spent the week working with the local historical society and the VFW. It's amazing how quickly red tape thins when a colonel starts asking questions and providing bank records. My goal was simple, a correction of the record. For years, the plaque near the memorial had listed Thomas Miller as a local son, whose family had upheld his legacy of charity. It was a plaque Howard had paid for in 1992, a clever bit of branding that linked his insurance business to his brother's blood. I watched as a city worker, a man in his 60s who had gone to school with my mother, carefully unscrewed that old bronze plaque. He handed it to me. It was heavy, cold, and felt like a piece of leaden fiction. "I always wondered, Sarah," the worker whispered, wiping his brow. "Your mom. She used to come sit here on this bench for hours. She never looked at Howard's name on that plate. She only ever looked at the etched name on the stone. I think she was waiting for you to grow up." I gripped the plaque tight. She was waiting for the truth to be strong enough to stand on its own gym. A new plaque was set in its place. It didn't mention Howard. It didn't mention the insurance firm. It simply read, "Captain Thomas Miller, 101st Airborne." A man of courage, survived by his daughter Colonel Sarah Miller, who carried his honor home. As the small crowd of veterans and locals began to disperse, a woman approached me. It was Mrs. Gable, my mother's best friend from the church choir. She was nearly 80 now, leaning heavily on a cane, her eyes hidden behind thick glasses. She reached out and took my hand, her skin feeling like crinkled silk. "Sarah," she said, her voice trembling, "I have something for you. I was too afraid to give it to you while he was the man he was." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet-covered box. Inside was a wedding ring, not the heavy ornate gold band Howard had forced onto my mother's finger, but a thin, delicate silver band with a tiny, modest diamond. "This was her real ring," Mrs. Gable said. "The one Thomas gave her before he shipped out. Howard told her to throw it in the river. He said it was a relic of a dead life. But Elena brought it to me. She told me that one day you would be a woman who didn't need to be protected from the truth anymore. She wanted you to have the silver, not the gold." I slid the ring onto my pinky finger. It was cold, but it felt right. My revenge had been a storm, but this was the quiet after the rain. I realized then that Howard's greatest crime wasn't the money he stole. It was the beauty he tried to erase. He had tried to replace love with prestige and truth with comfort, and in the end he had neither. Before I left town, I made one final stop. I drove to the VA home in Dayton. I didn't go inside to the sunroom. Instead, I went to the administrator's office. I handed them a check not from the Miller estate but from my own personal savings. "This is for the library fund here," I told the administrator. "I want you to buy books on history, real history, not the kind people make up to feel better about themselves." "Thank you, Colonel," the man said, looking at the check. "And your Mr. Miller, he's been asking for you." "Tell him I was here," I said softly. "Tell him I finished the work at the memorial. Tell him the name Thomas Miller is finally clean." I walked back to my car, feeling the weight of the silver ring on my finger and the silver eagles on my shoulders. I thought about the audience at my promotion ceremony, those men and women over 60 who had lived through the same era as my father and Howard. They had seen the same wars, the same lies, and the same struggles for dignity. They understood that revenge isn't about the person you hurt, it's about the person you become once the anger is gone. I had spent my life running away from a shadow only to realize that the shadow wasn't mine, it was Howard's. By stepping into the light, I hadn't just exposed him, I had freed myself. As I started the engine, I looked at the old tin box sitting in the passenger seat. It was empty now, its contents moved to the safe deposit box in the town's archives. It was just a piece of dented metal. I realized I didn't need it anymore. I reached out, picked it up, and placed it in the glove compartment. It was no longer a weapon. It was just a memory. The drive back to the base was long, but for the first time I wasn't rushing. I watched the sun set over the Ohio fields, the orange and purple hues bleeding into the horizon. I was a colonel in the United States Army. I was the daughter of Thomas and Elena. And I was finally at peace. The lesson I learned, the one I hope resonates with anyone who has ever felt overshadowed by a lie, is that honor is a quiet thing. It doesn't need a banquet hall or a microphone to be heard. It only needs one person with the courage to open the box and let the truth breathe. A month later, I sat in my new office, the morning light catching the silver eagle on my desk. My transition into this rank hadn't been the celebration I had envisioned, but it was something much more profound. It was a baptism. My phone buzzed a text from the administrator in Dayton. Howard had passed away in his sleep. No drama, no final speeches, just a quiet exit for a man who had lived his life at a roar. I didn't feel a surge of joy, nor did I feel the sharp sting of grief. I felt a sense of completion. I had given him the one thing he didn't deserve but desperately needed a chance to die without a lie pinned to his chest. I had reclaimed the stolen money, I had cleared Thomas's name, and I had seen the truth etched into the granite of our hometown. My revenge wasn't a fire that consumed. It was a fire that refined. I decided to hold a small private service, not for the man the world knew as Howard the Deacon, but for the man who was my mother's burden. I invited no one but Mrs. Gable and the general. As we stood at the graveside, the military honors were absent, rightfully so. But as I looked at the simple headstone I had paid for, I realized that the greatest revenge of all was my refusal to become like him. He had spent his life trying to destroy legacies to build his own. I had spent this month building a legacy of truth, even at the cost of my own comfort. To those of you listening, perhaps sitting in a quiet living room or driving down a road that feels too familiar, I want you to look at the tin boxes in your own lives. We all have them, the secrets we keep to protect a reputation, the lies we inherit from parents who were too afraid to be human, the silences that grow like mold in the corners of our homes. For many of us over 60, we were raised in an era where saving face was considered a virtue. We were told that family laundry stays in the basement and that the appearance of honor is just as good as the real thing. But I am here to tell you that a lie is a heavy coat to wear in the winter of your life. It doesn't keep you warm, it just weighs you down. Revenge, in the way the world defines it, is a hollow victory. If I had simply destroyed Howard and left him in the gutter, I would have carried his bitterness into my new rank. I would have been a colonel with a heart full of ash. Instead, I chose a different path. I chose to use the truth not as a hammer but as a flashlight. I chose to forgive not because he earned it but because my soul deserved to be light. We often think it's too late to change the narrative. We think that after 30 or 40 years the concrete has set and the story is written. But honor doesn't have an expiration date. Justice doesn't have a statute of limitations when it comes to the human heart. Whether you are 22 or 72, you have the right to stand up in your own ceremony and say, "No more pretending." My mother lived her life in a quiet cage of fear, but she left me the key. Your key might be a phone call you've been dreading, a letter you need to write, or a truth you finally need to tell your children. It's never too late to reclaim your name. It's never too late to be the person your younger self believed you would be. As I walked away from the cemetery, I touched the thin silver ring on my finger. It wasn't as flashy as the gold one Howard had bought, but it was real. And in a world of shadows and polished facades, real is the only thing that lasts. I am Colonel Sarah Miller. I am the daughter of a hero who was forgotten and a woman who was silenced. But today I am loud, I am clear, and I am finally home. A final thought for my listeners. Thank you for walking this long road with me. If this story touched a nerve, if it reminded you of a truth you've been holding back, or a person you need to forgive, I invite you to reflect on that today. We often spend our lives waiting for someone else to give us permission to be honest. Consider this your permission. If you found value in this journey of honor and reconciliation, please share this story with someone who might be struggling with their own shadows. Subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and the American spirit. Remember, the truth doesn't just set you free, it gives you back to yourself. God bless and stand tall.